Well, thank you very much for coming out tonight. My name is Ted Reinstein. I'll have to yell to get back to the folks in the comfy seats back there. I don't blame you. Those look very comfortable. I'm tempted to do my talk from back there, but I'm not going to be able to raise my voice loud enough necessarily to reach you at all moments back there. And you're practically on the town line over there. So do feel free to move up. Having said all that, so good news is that this is not last week where I was still getting over. Anybody have that coughing cold going around? Right? The thing that's decimated the Red Sox? Anyway, so this time last week I had no voice. So it's pretty much back. So thank you for indulging about the 25% or so of my voice that's still missing. But we'll make do. So how many of you were at my book talk here in Southborough a couple of years ago with my first book? Oh, not bad. Not bad. I like these folks better already. Not bad. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my new book, my second book, Wicked Pissed, which is all about some of the favorite feuds that I have tracked and researched throughout New England. Think of it a little bit like a dinner. We're going to first take you through kind of an appetizer round of some tasty little finger feuds, give you a sense of what's in the book, the kind of variety, and then we're going to lead our way up to the main course, the featured feud, which is the most delicious dispute I can almost guarantee you've never heard of. So the first thing I always say that I found in researching feuds is that with very few exceptions, people are fascinated by feuds. They find it very difficult to turn away if it's an interesting feud, with one major exception, unless it's yours. Unless it's yours. If it's your feud, if it's your headache, gets less interesting very, very quickly. And I point out in the book that, of course, we had to have a critical mass of people before you could have a feud. You had to have more than one person. So the first sort of recorded feud in human history is, of course, in the Bible. I do point out, however, I devote an entire chapter not to Cain and Abel, but instead to New England's most famous family feud, and arguably one of the world's largest family feuds in all of history, and that, of course, would be the dueling Demoulasses and the Market Basket feud. Right. Anytime you have a feud which ensnares upwards of 25,000 people, goes on for 3 decades, and end up costing upwards of $35 million, that's a hell of a feud. That is a hell of a feud. This is an example of a feud. I thought, as long as we're in this wonderful literary environment tonight, I would include this. Not only is it an example of a wonderful feud that most people have no idea has New England roots, but it also points up, at this point now I realize my cluelessness. Anybody know who this is? No clue. Someone in Rudyard Kipling, right. Now see, I'm not surprised that someone in the front row. You won't get this back there, but I'm not surprised that someone in the front row said Rudyard Kipling. It does have the name there, which is where the cluelessness on my part comes in. So I started doing this book talk last spring, right? Last year now. And for the longest time, I would put that slide up, and invariably someone in the first 2 rows would say, that's Rudyard Kipling. And I'd be like, huh, this is interesting. And as time went on, I started to develop a theory, thinking how brilliant I was about this sociological theory. I developed that I'm starting to realize, I thought to myself, that people who are more like literate and really know their literature like to sit in like the first 2 rows. Because they know that's Rudyard Kipling every time, right? And 6 months in, I realized that his name was up there. So there went that theory, and I stopped complimenting myself on being this brilliant sociological observationalist. So, but it is Rudyard Kipling. And he is, of course, one of world literature's most iconic figures. Born in Mumbai, India, and of course becomes the face of Victorian England. Anybody know where Rudyard Kipling spent 3 of his most productive years as a writer? It is not written up there. Very good. Very good. Vermont. Yes, Vermont. This is Rudyard Kipling's dream house, Nolaka, which is a Hindi word meaning gem of gems, which he built in the rolling hills of West Brattleboro, Vermont, Dummerston, where he could look out on the hills of New Hampshire, Mount Monadnock, and I think he fully expected to live out his life there. He loved it. There he is in the study of Nolaka, where he arguably wrote his most famous book, The Jungle Book. Unfortunately for Rudyard Kipling, had a terrible falling out with his brother-in-law. Now, if you have a terrible falling out with a family member, and you live in Southborough, and that family member lives in, let's say, Wichita, it may cause you some degree of angst, but you're not going to be in each other's hair every day. But unfortunately for Kipling, his brother-in-law lived literally next door. So there was no getting around it. He was an intensely private person. This became a court case. It involved assault. It was ugly, and it drove Rudyard Kipling to leave Vermont, never to return. The good news is, though, Nolaka is still there, and you can rent it and sit, as I did, for about 2.5 hours. I thought they were going to charge me for the week, in Rudyard Kipling's writing chair. Now, I joked about starting with the Bible and so forth, but I actually start the book with America's founding feud, which, of course, is what? Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution. Yeah, you don't get a bigger feud than a shooting war with a body count. That's a real feud. So, and of course, it starts in the early morning hours of April 19, 1775. Lexington Green, where, of course, the shot heard round the world is fired. And then the British move on to the Old North Bridge in Concord, where they're met by a larger rebel force, and, of course, their day goes downhill very quickly. But, what's interesting about Lexington and Concord is that if you think about America's closest ally in the world today, or this week, or last week, it's changeable, right? It's like one gets the sense it could change. But traditionally, let's say that, you would think of Great Britain, right? And still fighting the American Revolution, Concord and Lexington. They're still arguing today over which town deserves the mantle of birthplace of American liberty, to which, so it's kind of the battle after the battle. Now, this is an example of a feud from the exact same era, happens only 2 months later, after Lexington and Concord. And what's interesting about this feud is that while people know about what could be the source of it, they don't realize, as I didn't, and I prefer to think if I didn't realize something no one in the world did, that it's still going on today, still very much going on today. And this, of course, involves Bunker Hill, where the battle is fought barely 2 months after Lexington and Concord, and the British win the battle, but could be said to begin to lose the war right there. Now, how many of you are lifelong New Englanders? Most of you. So you know in a way that, say, a group in Wichita might not know right off the bat that the Battle of Bunker Hill was not fought on Bunker Hill, right? It was fought on Breed's Hill, exactly. Now, this has been called by many historians, many observers, one of the worst historical errors in American history. In fact, no less a wonderful historian and writer, one of my favorite, Nathaniel Philbrick. Anybody read anything by Philbrick, right? Wonderful book about the Essex tragedy. His most recent book, The Mayflower, about the Pilgrim's First Winter. And he wrote a book about 10 years ago about the Battle of Bunker Hill, in which he refers to the misnaming of Bunker Hill as the most egregious historical inaccuracy in American history. Know what he called his book? Bunker Hill. Thereby perpetuating the most egregious historical inaccuracy in American history. And even though they don't deserve it, even though they didn't earn it, even though it is patently untrue, 13 generations and counting now of bunkers get the monument named after them, and the guided missile frigate named after them, and the community college named after them, and cities and towns across America named after them, and a drag strip in Indiana named after them. You want really crazy? And a chili sauce. Yeah. Now, and this is what the Breeds get. This is what the Breeds get. They succeeded in the 1930s to persuading the Massachusetts state legislature to install a plaque inside the Bunker Hill Monument to point out that the hill was misnamed. Now, how's this for adding insult to injury? Breed's Hill, site of the Battle of Bunker Hill. They just can't win. The Breeds, like my friend Jed Breed, Cambridge, 13th generation descendant of Alan G. Breed, for whom the actual hill where the actual battle was actually fought. And you know, Jed tells me that he still feels honor bound. If he's out and about and he hears somebody talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill, he still feels honor bound to the legacy of his forebears to politely correct them. I've told him he's lucky to still have all his front teeth. Now, I only include one sports feud in the book, but even though there are many to choose from in New England. But this is the only one that stands all by itself. It has its own nomenclature. If you say the rivalry, everybody knows you're talking about the rivalry that begins with the most famous Red Sox of all time right there, who becomes the most famous Yankee of all time. And it goes on through the decades in the 40s with DiMaggio and Williams, and into the 70s with Fisk and Munson. And that leads, of course, to the creation of the Munson-Nixon line. Yeah, you know, the Munson-Nixon line is the putative boundary between Red Sox Nation in red to the north and the evil empire in blue to the south. And it runs right through Hartford, Connecticut, which is perfect because that's where we're going to pick up our main feud. Now, this involves first flight, right? You're looking at what has been called arguably the most reproduced photograph in history. This is mid-morning, December 17th, 1903. Orville Wright at the controls of the Wright Flyer, his brother Wilbur running alongside, and we have the creation of the airplane as we would come to know it, and first flight. A dream of humankind for millennia, and it made the Wright brothers justly world famous. This is them pictured on the front porch of their home in Dayton, Ohio, 6 years later, in 1909. Now, what if I told you that this strange-looking machine rose into the air a full 2 years before the Wright brothers, before Kitty Hawk, and this gentleman actually might deserve the honor of having invented the airplane and flown first. Anybody ever hear of Gustav Whitehead? Nope. Gustav Whitehead was born Gustav Weisskopf in Leutershausen, Germany. He was known even as a boy as the bird, obsessed with flying. His first job when he emigrated to America around 1900 was in Massachusetts, not too far from here, in Milton, at the Great Blue Hill Weather Observatory, where he got a job designing weather balloons. And by 1901, he had moved on to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where he was at work on his 21st flying machine. 21st. Number 20 cracked up when he flew into the third story of a building in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Third story, 35 feet off the ground. So you might be wondering why you've never heard of Whitehead, why you've never seen this photograph. This photograph has been around 2 years longer than the photograph we saw of the Wright brothers, right? This is 1901. Why have you never seen this photograph? Why have you never heard of Whitehead? By the summer of 1901, Whitehead and his crew were busy fitting out and tweaking number 21 in the background there. I use the word crew advisedly. Whitehead, who's right here, Whitehead is the only trained engineer of the group. He was an engine builder. So a couple of thoughts, because I think it's important. Why we don't know more about Whitehead. Why you've never seen this photograph. The first has to do with, in the bigger sense, how we learn about history in general, not just relating to first flight, any history. So over time, after a historical event, a significant historical event, over time, 75, 100 years out from that event, we begin to lose the broader context, the richer context that contemporaries of that event knew all about. We take for granted now some of the things that have happened in recent history. 100 years from now, our descendants will not have the advantage of that rich history unless they research it. It won't be at their fingertips. We lose that over time. And the way this relates to first flight is that we have lost When we learn about the Wright brothers, I think most of us, you think back, you have in your head that the story of first flight is a story of Wilbur and Orville Wright. These somewhat peculiar brothers, right? Bicycle builders. Dayton, Ohio, obsessed, single-mindedly obsessed with creating the airplane. And for the better part of a decade, they go back and forth from Dayton, Ohio to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And then one morning, December 17th, 1903, finally, miraculously, it works. I call it the myth of immaculate aviation. Because nothing I just said isn't true. That's not the point. The point is what's missing. They were not alone. The Wright brothers were not alone in racing to create the airplane. The operative word there being racing. It was a race to create the airplane. There were other aviation pioneers who were trying to also fly first, including Gustav Whitehead. The others are lost to history now, including Whitehead, Canute, Langley, Lilienthal, Whitehead. Langley may sound familiar because he has an Air Force base named after him. But the others are lost. So the point is, we lose some of this broader context. And it can be critical because the Wright brothers might not have been first. The other thing is what was necessary to create first flight. There were 4 elements that had to be achieved to create first flight. 3 of them, by the time both Whitehead and the Wright brothers were trying to do it from 1901 forward, had already been achieved with gliders. So within 30 years, there will be some extraordinary women aviators. But at this point, I use the word man because the early pioneers were all male. So a flight had to be manned. It had to be controlled. It had to be sustained, all of which had been achieved with gliders. The 4th was the hurdle that had eluded humankind for millennia. Had to be powered. Had to be powered. People had tried everything. Sam Langley tried water, steam power. Can you imagine? You know how much water it would take to lift a 747 off the ground? It was never going to work, and it didn't. Both of his early test flights, right into the drink in the Potomac. Whitehead, because he's an engine builder, has settled on a brilliant 2-stroke engine, which is on the ground right there in front of these guys, to be powered by a fuel source no one has yet tried. The chemical acetylene. Extremely lightweight, which is key. Burns with a very short, intense burst of heat and light, almost like magnesium. Highly flammable. And he has settled on this fuel source and this engine, which he feels by the summer of 1901 will give him a technological edge. When you're in a race, whether it's the space race or the race to fly first, and you think you suddenly have an edge, you go for it. So by August of 1901, they are ready to go for it because they think they have settled on a combination that will allow them to fly this heavier-than-air machine. So August 1901, and by the way, before we get to the fateful day here, I just want to point out, back to that sense of why we don't know more about things that happened 75, 100 years out, and how contemporaries do and did. You know, journalism has sometimes been called the first draft of history. You're looking at the first draft. So his contemporaries knew all about him. Front page of a Bridgeport newspaper, an in-depth magazine piece, the front cover of American Inventor, 1901, forerunner of popular mechanics, huge distribution for its day. Gustav Whitehead on the front cover. So I don't want you to think that we've just invented him. Whitehead's contemporaries knew all about him just over 100 years ago. August 14th, 1901 is the day in question, the day that Whitehead might have made history. It is hot. It is humid in Bridgeport. Whitehead and his crew have spent a couple of days rolling out a dirt road, a long straight dirt road just over the Bridgeport line in Fairfield to act as a crude runway because, by the way, you know, the Wright brothers used gravity to get into the air, right? At Kill Devil Hill, Kitty Hawk, they ran a steel track down a sand dune. Gravity, get into the air. Later on, back in Ohio, they constructed a catapult to get the Wright flyer into the air. Whitehead doesn't have to. Although you can't see it, there are wheels under number 21. Gustav Whitehead will taxi to achieve critical speed and liftoff, just like a 747 would today. So it is early. I want you to remember that. It's 5 a.m. It's dark. This is a choice. This is a choice they've made. The sun will not rise for 30 minutes, just over 30 minutes. They fuel up. They power up. They remove a couple of boulders that are acting as crude chocks in front of the wheels. Whitehead taxis for about 75 feet, and he's airborne. He banks a right turn to the northeast over Long Island Sound, turns toward the city of Bridgeport. This is an artist's rendering of what number 21 might have looked like in flight. He approached the shoreline of Bridgeport, and within 30 minutes and just over half a mile, he landed back in Bridgeport. So the question is, did he do it? Let's suppose for a moment that he did, to look at how the numbers compare. So if he did it, so the Wright brothers flew for about 15 seconds at a height of, let's say today's NBA center, for about 120 feet. Whitehead flew for just over half a mile, just over half an hour, at a height of 50 feet, or the height of most five-story buildings in downtown Bridgeport at that time. So again, how come you've never seen this photograph? This photograph's been around 2 years longer than the photo of the Wright brothers. And this might have flown first. I think the key in this photograph, as to why we may not know more about it, is what Whitehead is holding in his arms. He's holding his first child, his oldest daughter, Rose. So Gustav Whitehead was a poor German immigrant. He was a German immigrant at a time of rising, sometimes virulently anti-German sentiment. Within less than 10 years after this photograph was taken, World War I will break out in Europe with Germany. He was a German immigrant who spoke no English, and he also had what we would call today uncertain immigration status. Sound familiar? And there was no wall to keep him out. So I think the only thing that worried Whitehead more than missing out on the glory that would be first flight was somehow running afoul of the authorities and the system and the rules, which he did not fully understand, but understood that he might be vulnerable. And what scared him, I think, more than missing out on the glory of first flight was any possibility that he might be deported, separated from his family. So he had a difficult calculation to make. He knew that he had a machine that might fly. And he knew that in attracting too much attention, all that might come to naught. So he decided to somehow buck the odds by trying to decrease the level of risk of being found out. And what he settled on was flying in the dark. At a time of day when he could limit the number of people who were apt to see him and see what he was doing. And it may have worked all too well, as we will see. He never flew again. He turned to building engine components to support his family. He did design a prototype for a helicopter shortly before he died. And in 1927, he died in Bridgeport, penniless and essentially unknown. And if that was the end of the Whitehead story, this would be a very short talk. But what happens next over the next basically 100 years, up to the present day, and is still happening, is that a series of 5 people come along at almost irregular intervals. And each one of these 5 people has a skill set, an area of expertise that allows them, because they are interested in the Whitehead story. If they hadn't been interested, it wouldn't have mattered. But each one of them would have represented a link in this chain, which is why it's interesting, cumulatively, what they were able to do. And the first person who comes along to advance the Whitehead story is an extraordinary woman named Stella Randolph. Light years ahead of her time. In the 1930s, she's an attorney, she's a journalist, she's a teacher. And she realizes by about 1940 that there is an element to the Whitehead story that's never been told. And she realizes, furthermore, that if it isn't told now, the opportunity will be lost forever. Because although there is no known photograph of Whitehead on the morning of his flight, August 14th, 1901, it is well known, since he flew, that there were almost 30 eyewitnesses who, despite his best efforts, people who saw him, people who heard him, but they've never given sworn eyewitness legal testimony. So in the mid-1940s, Stella Randolph goes to Bridgeport. She legally deposes all these eyewitnesses, and they become the subject of the first two books, both by Stella Randolph, written about Gustav Whitehead. And by the late 1940s, for the very first time, people outside of Connecticut have begun to learn about Whitehead. And by the late 1940s, Connecticut is fielding queries almost daily for the first time from journalists, historians, researchers. They want to know, what is this story, Connecticut? What do you got up there? Who's this Whitehead guy? What are you sitting on? Well, Connecticut is sitting on tons of archival material, historical evidence, journals, first-hand accounts, first source material. What they don't have, what Connecticut does not have, is the expertise to carry out what needs to be done at long last. And that is an expert forensics aviation investigation into what's the likelihood that this thing flew. So by late 1940, 1947, Connecticut appeals to the one institution in America that has that expertise, that can do that investigation, the Smithsonian Institution. And by 1947, the Smithsonian responds to Connecticut's several requests, official requests, and the response will really floor Connecticut. How can I, well, actually, you know what? It's a brief enough response. I'm going to throw the entire text of the Smithsonian's response. No. No, thank you. So you can understand Connecticut is a bit befuddled. What? No, you don't want to investigate a rival claim for first flight? What? So they're a bit befuddled, and they begin searching for clues as to why the Smithsonian doesn't want to investigate this story. The first clue takes us back to history's most famous airplane, the Wright Flyer. You're looking at the Wright Flyer on the day that it was unveiled to the public at the Smithsonian, 1948, having been bequeathed to the Smithsonian by the Wright family, the heirs of Wilbur and Orville Wright. So how does this enter into it? Well, this guy, a native son of Connecticut, Lowell Weicker. Lowell Weicker is a former Republican senator, governor, attorney general of Connecticut. You may recall he was on the Watergate Committee. He has been hearing since the 1960s at this point. He has begun hearing rumors. People will tell him, you know, Lowell, if you want to know why the Smithsonian doesn't want to investigate the Whitehead story, you might want to take a look at the agreement that they signed with the Wright family when they got the plane. He'd love to do that, but the Smithsonian has no interest in sharing this agreement with him until 1978, when Lowell Weicker becomes the first public official to be able to take advantage of a relatively new piece of legislation called the Freedom of Information Act. And because the Smithsonian is a taxpayer-supported institution, they have no private papers anymore. They have to turn over the agreement for him to look at. He does, and he sees exactly what people have been talking about. Most of the agreement is solid boilerplate. Duration of the gift, security, maintenance, blah, blah, blah. At the very end, there is a clause that catches his prosecutor eye instantly. What it says is, basically verbatim, is that in taking possession of the Wright Flyer, the Smithsonian is enjoined, forbidden, and otherwise may never acknowledge that anyone but the Wright brothers flew first. If they do, the Wright family can take back the Wright Flyer. It becomes known as the secret agreement, and it falls to our friend Stella Randolph in the center to emerge once again, joined by the next person who's come along, Major Bill O'Dwyer. He's a retired Air Force major, decorated pilot from the Second World War. He has come along to join with her in writing a book in 1978 called History by Contract, in which the premise of the book is there is a rival claim, America, to first flight. It's a legitimate claim that bears investigation. The one institution in America that has the expertise to investigate this claim and put it to rest one way or the other won't do it. Why? They have a conflict of interest. Well, you can imagine this is not a fun time for the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian is not used to negative publicity, and this is a blitzkrieg of negative publicity at this time. You can go back and Google it. So it's particularly an uncomfortable period for the Smithsonian because guess what's happening right at the same time? They've opened the Air and Space Museum. And the Wright Flyer is the centerpiece of the Air and Space Museum. So they now have to comment on this supposed secret agreement. And they do. No. Not a secret. Here's the problem. Very simple. You didn't ask. Don't you know if you want to know if someone has a secret, you got to say to them, you got any secrets? You got any secrets? You? Furthermore, they said, there is no evidence that anyone flew before the Wright brothers, even though, as Lowell Weicker points out in his companion press conference, you've never looked at a shred of evidence. Tom Crouch. Tom Crouch is one of the founders of the Air and Space Museum. He is now the aviation curator emeritus of the Air and Space Museum. Knows everything there is to know about the history of American aviation. I interviewed Tom in the process of writing my book. Connecticut has a problem with Tom Crouch. Their first problem with Tom Crouch is that just like the Wright brothers, he's a native of Dayton, Ohio. I disagree with Connecticut on that one. You don't pick where you're born. And it doesn't mean that you can't be objective. Their bigger problem with Tom Crouch is that he's also the first official biographer of the Wright brothers. That's a bigger problem. Nonetheless, by 1980, which is where we're at with this saga now, by 1980, the answer to Connecticut every time they ask for the Smithsonian to investigate this story is still no. Still no. So we get to 1980, and the next person who's come along to advance the Whitehead story, Andy Koch. Andy Koch is a fascinating guy. Andy Koch is a world-class adventurer. He's in his late 70s now, which speaks to what an extraordinarily dedicated teacher he is, still teaching full-time in Fairfield. He is also a master craftsman. And in 1980, he goes to a talk in Hartford, Connecticut, being given by Major Bill O'Dwyer. And he goes up to him afterward and he says, you know, Major, I know that your interest in the Whitehead story is whether or not number 21 was airworthy, which is true. His interest has always been, could this thing have flown? If we could fly it again and satisfy ourselves that it was airworthy or not, we wouldn't have to keep arguing with the Smithsonian. If we tried to fly this thing and it wouldn't fly, I would say forget about it. So he goes up to him and he says, you know, Major, I'm prepared to build a replica, an authentic replica of number 21. And then we can find out if it was airworthy. And the Major says, good luck with that. Keep me posted. And Andy Koch goes ahead and builds it. Now that looks a little small to fly, granted. But that was his plan. He first built a 3/8 scale replica. And he convened a panel of world aviation experts. This is the head of Sikorsky Aviation. And his feeling was that only if these guys thought that he was on the right path would he go and build a full-scale replica. And they thought he was very much on the right path, and he built a full-scale replica. Now, when I tell you that that was a painstakingly authentic replica, I mean down to the tiniest thread, and I mean that literally. The white muslin that formed the fuselage of number 21, Gustav Whitehead had obtained it from a village outside Madras, India, and Andy Koch got it from the same family that was still producing it. There was not a nut, a bolt, a nail, a screw on that replica that was not commercially available in 1901. Now, when I talked to Andy Koch, you know, I said, Andy, listen, I've read everything there is to read about the replica flight And far be it from me, what the hell do I know, to quibble about the replica. But I said, you know, there's still things that will never be known. Like wind speed, direction, on the morning of August 14th, 1901, when Whitehead flew. Critical. One of the top 3 metrics that would be critical to a forensics investigation. We'll never know. We'll never know what the wind speeds were. We'll never know were they tailwinds, headwinds, crosswinds. Never know. And he kind of cut me off. He said, listen, when we flew the replica flight, and by the way, Andy Koch did not fly it. Now, in 1901, Gustav Whitehead didn't need a pilot's license because there was no such thing as a pilot. But in 1986, you did need a pilot's license. 87, you did need a pilot's license. So Andy Koch had a friend fly it for him, famous friend. Anybody remember the actor Cliff Robertson? Yeah, the movie Charlie. He played JFK in the movie about PT-109. Cliff Robertson was a commercial pilot. He died a few years ago, but was a friend of Andy Koch. He flew it. So as Andy Koch is telling the story, he says, you know, when we flew, he said, Cliff began to roll, and he reached for the tiller. Because, by the way, this strange-looking half-bird, half-Da Vinci, half-plane-looking thing had a tiller. And the tiller operated a central mast. From the central mast, there were a series of guy wires that fanned out to all these segments of the wings. Now, we said before that for first flight, you had to have a flight that was controllable, right? The Wright Flyer was controllable, make no mistake. Not in a way that a pilot would feel comfortable today, but it was technically controllable. Not in the same way number 21 was. Those wires that went out to the wings operated essentially what Whitehead had invented, the forerunner of the aileron, wing flaps. Number 21, unlike the Wright Flyer, was controllable in every dimension in space. So he said Cliff reached for the tiller and his watch popped off. Now the watch was not an ordinary watch. The watch had an altimeter on it, which was crucial to knowing whether or not the plane reached 50 feet. So he said Cliff fumbled around at first on the floor of the fuselage, but then he realized the only thing worse than losing the watch would be losing control of the plane. So he said he brought himself into his upright position and realized he was already 35 feet off the ground. He said all that thing wanted to do was get into the air, and it did. With the same amount of acetylene fuel that Whitehead had, Robertson realized after 30 minutes he still had half a tank of gas. So he decided to expend the full tank. He flew for almost an hour. He made a perfect landing back in Bridgeport. He got a hero's welcome. There's Cliff Robertson. Got a hero's welcome. And a year later, the Whitehead story goes national in a way it never has before. 60 Minutes did the first of 2 stories, wondering whether the Wrights were wrong. And along comes the 4th and final person to advance the Whitehead story, John Brown. John Brown, the most important person in the story, who's done the most to advance the Whitehead story, up to the present day, literally this year, grew up, never heard of Whitehead. He may never have heard of Connecticut, but he has a good excuse. He grew up in Sydney, Australia. John Brown is an aviation historian. He is a detective, has a photographic memory. And in 2000, John Brown, in what can only be described as a stunning twist of irony, is hired to produce a series of TV specials here in the States about the history of American aviation. Know who hires him? The Smithsonian. Big mistake. Tom Crouch, who will regret this decision to his dying day. So in September 2000, John Brown comes over to Washington to meet with Tom Crouch. And at the end of the meeting, he says, Tom, what do you know about Gustav Whitehead? And Tom Crouch says, you know he didn't fly, right? So I told you that John Brown's a detective. To his detective ear, he has just heard what a detective would call a classic tell. He asked a question, did not get a germane answer to his question, but got somebody who seemed to be defensively going off in a different direction. Either way, he heard what he wanted to hear. He checked out of his hotel the next morning. He went directly to Bridgeport, Connecticut, where it took him less than 48 hours to find something Connecticut had long despaired no longer existed, a contemporaneous newspaper account, next day's Bridgeport Evening Post, local boy flies over Long Island Sound. He went directly from there to Leutershausen, Germany, where he rummaged around in the attic of the Whitehead Museum, and he found this photograph. Now this gets interesting, bear with me. This is the photograph he was looking at, right? Same photograph you're looking at. His eye was drawn to this photograph in a photograph. Now, I can look at that right here. I can look at that right here. You could all file by and look at that with your nose pressed up against that. It would look like nothing like shadows. And yet, John Brown said, I need a magnifying glass right away. They brought him a magnifying glass. He said, this won't do. I need this photograph enlarged. They said, well, we don't have an enlarger, but we'll run you over to the local police station. Maybe they can help. They couldn't help, but they said, jump in. We'll run you over to the local equivalent of the German FBI. They can enlarge it. They could. They enlarged it 35%. Then he was looking at this. I told you he has a photographic memory. When John Brown was looking at this, he was put in mind of Stella Randolph's second book, and Eyewitness Testimonial number 26. Eyewitness Testimonial number 26 was of a bank teller whose job it was on the morning of August 14th, 1901, to open up the bank building in downtown Bridgeport. He said he was opening up the bank about 5:35. Whitehead was said to have landed in Bridgeport in a vacant lot opposite the bank about 5:33. The teller said that as he went to unlock the front door, he dropped his keys because he was startled to hear what sounded like a lawnmower over his head. But before he could see anything, he said his gaze was drawn to a man across the street on the roof of the building across the street, where he said on the roof there was a man standing with a box camera on a tripod. We will never know the provenance of this photograph, I don't believe. Nobody believes. So we don't know if that shutter was clicked. John Brown hypothesized that if the shutter was clicked, that camera would have been in position to get the only known photograph of number 21 as it came to rest, landing opposite the bank in downtown Bridgeport. The Smithsonian calls this photograph the smudge. Either way, John Brown returned to the United States, began speaking extensively about Gustav Whitehead, garnering more media attention in all kinds of media outlets. And in 2013, the most significant event to date, the editors of Jane's All the World's Aircraft were meeting in March 2013 at an air show in Frankfurt, Germany. Because John Brown at that point was living in Munich, he asked them for a meeting. He told them he had some compelling evidence about first flight. They slotted out 20 minutes for this meeting. 90 minutes later, the meeting broke up. 2 months later, the centennial edition of Jane's hit the newsstands, in which there was an announcement from the editors in which they said, it is now the editorial opinion of Jane's that first flight happened not in 1903 in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, but in 1901 in Bridgeport, Connecticut. That is all Connecticut had to hear. So for basically 100 years, Connecticut has heard from North Carolina, Ohio, the Smithsonian, basically to get lost with this cockamamie Whitehead story. And in June 2013, the Connecticut State Assembly, without a single dissenting vote, try doing that with another piece of legislation today, passed a bill that today makes Connecticut, as of 2013, the only state in America that officially recognizes someone other than the Wright brothers as first in flight. So as we finish, the question, of course, you may be wondering is, does this change history? Should this change history? And my personal feeling is, no. Now, you might have thought I was leading up to a different conclusion. But let me say this. My no, my N-O, unlike the Smithsonian's, comes with a bright red asterisk. Because here's the thing. The Wright brothers understood in December 1903 that at that point in history, given the technology, only a photograph would be able to act as proof positive, definitive proof that they flew. They understood they'd need that. They had 3 photographers spread out on the dunes that morning. Ironically, only one of them got a picture, but that's all they needed. Gustav Whitehead might have been a poor German immigrant who spoke no English, but he was no dummy. He understood he also would need a photograph. He did the best that he could do to prevent a photograph from happening. And to his, undoubtedly to his dying day, that may have worked only too well. But if you ask me, I think without that smoking gun, we can't say definitively that he flew. We can't. But if you ask me, do I think there is an extraordinary possibility that Whitehead flew first? My answer is yes. So given the fact that it doesn't change history, if you go to Kitty Hawk today, maybe some of you have, you will see this soaring monument to the Wright brothers. If you go to Bridgeport today, somewhat less soaring. All I can tell you is if you want to see the monument to Whitehead and you reach this intersection, pray for a red light. It goes by very quickly. It took Connecticut another year and a half just to appropriate the money to inscribe the marble at the bottom. But here's the thing, and I'll finish right now the same way I finished the chapter on Whitehead in the book, in which obviously I go into greater detail. But the point is, we've talked about tonight in this story, there are all these experts and august institutions and states, and whether or not they would deign to think it's possible that Whitehead flew first. There is one spot on God's green earth, small, 2.5 square miles, 3, that for over 100 years has not needed any august institution. They haven't needed a panel of experts. They haven't needed any forensics analysis to know whether or not Whitehead flew, because they have oral history. Oral history is a powerful thing. It's powerful when it's your family. Listen, if you think about in your own family, whether it's a great uncle or a great aunt or a great-great-grandfather, listen, details may get embellished over time, but the nugget of that history that has been passed along in your family is true. It's true because it's been orally passed along through the generations, such as it is in Bridgeport. Communities are families. They're cumulative families. And in Bridgeport, they know that on a hot August morning in 1901, a poor German immigrant chasing the American dream rose into the air in a plane he built with his hands and flew. Period. There is one thing in which everybody in Connecticut, though, as more of this story has come to light, everybody in Connecticut agrees. At the least, there is a feeling that at the least, North Carolina should tweak its license plate. Throw us a bone. Come on. At the very least. And that is Wicked Piss. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. So, if anybody has a question or two, I'm happy to answer a question or two. It doesn't have to be about first flight. We've just given up an hour of our life tonight talking about first flight. So, it doesn't have to be about first flight. It could be about anything, but happy to answer a couple of questions. Yes?
About first flight.
Yeah.
The Wright brothers are very prone to sue people they saw infringing upon anything that dealt with flight. In fact, they took their flyer and hid it away for a while. Is there any evidence that, they must have known about this at the time?
They did. That's one of the interesting sidebars to this whole story, is that, to go all the way back to the beginning, we were talking about how it was a race, and there were other early aviation pioneers. And everybody knew what each other was doing. Canute became very friendly with the Wright brothers, and it was often thought at some point he was very friendly with Wilbur. Orville was suspicious that he was stealing their ideas. He was in their home. He would come and visit. They knew what Whitehead was doing. There has long been a theory, a suspicion that the Wright brothers actually came to Bridgeport at some point around 1900 to see what he was up to. Never been proven. I have never seen any real evidence or read any evidence that's compelling. But they knew about Whitehead, absolutely. Whitehead certainly knew all about the Wright brothers. In fact, every time they went back to Kitty Hawk for a period, he became worried that this might be it. This might be it. So they certainly knew about each other. I think that if they knew enough about what Whitehead was doing, it's unlikely that they felt threatened by his design, which I think they felt wouldn't work. The Wright brothers were famous for their attention to detail, and it is said that they scoffed at what he might be up to there. But there is no evidence that they ever thought about suing him. They did, especially later, there were lawsuits. But that's a great point, because they certainly were not, especially once they had the patent. Now, don't forget, Whitehead flew in 1901. So at that point, the Wright brothers didn't have anything patented. There was really nothing to sue over. It was after 1903 that the Wright brothers sued over patent infringement. So he was seen, if anything, as someone who might beat them, depending on how much they knew, which we're not really sure. Anyone else? Anyone else? Yes, in the back, and then you. Yes, ma'am.
What was your criteria for the different feuds, and was there one that was cut out, didn't make the cut?
Yeah. What was the criteria for the feuds? When I was working on it, I felt like they had to be feuds that had some kind of universal appeal by Universal. I mean, that a wide number of people would find it interesting, as opposed to, because while I was working on this and had let people know, especially through like social media and so forth, that if you know of an interesting feud, most of those that I heard from people were like, I gotta tell you about my Aunt Edna and her brother Frank. Because this thing's been going on. Right. So that was like the opposite of what, right. So that was the kind of thing that was easy to dismiss. There are some others that, frankly, I wish that I had included, because I thought they might be just too local. But in fact, as I have come to find out later, some of them are really wonderful feuds that touch on some interesting national history. And I regret that didn't make the cut, and I wish they had. And the one that I'm thinking of is actually very close to you guys, in Westborough. And anybody ever heard of the John Brown Bell? Yeah? So the John Brown Bell is one that I dearly wish I had included. I did a story about it for Chronicle recently because someone had told me about it. Unfortunately, it was kind of after the fact. I just found out about it as I was finishing the book. But the John Brown Bell, if you want to check it out later on your own, is really interesting. It sits in the middle of Westborough, in the town. What? Marlborough. I'm sorry. Did I say Westborough?
That's okay. Yeah, it is Marlborough.
It is Marlborough. It is definitely Marlborough. I'm sorry. I knew it was one of the boroughs. But it is Marlborough. And it sits in the middle in a tower. But the interesting thing about it is a bell that sat originally was in the building in which the abolitionist John Brown was captured by U.S. troops. And all kinds of interesting stuff related to that. You know, the troops, these are federal troops that were sent to put down this act of rebellion before the Civil War. They were led by Robert E. Lee, Colonel Robert E. Lee, who became the Confederate general. But the bell was taken by Marlborough soldiers, and they were volunteer firemen. And they knew that their firehouse back in Marlborough needed a bell. And they were allowed to take the bell. And Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, has over the years repeatedly, or at different times, has tried to get it back. There was even a raid in the 60s where some guys came up in the middle of the night and tried to take it. Now the bell is alarmed and bolted. So Marlborough's ready. But that's an example of a feud that didn't make the cut. I wish it had. Anyone else? You had a question, yes.
Of the ones that you did pick to put into the book, you focused tonight mostly on the flight. Is there anyone in particular that you enjoyed the most looking into?
Yeah. I love the feud between the city of Boston and Edgar Allan Poe. I don't know if you know that Edgar Allan Poe was born in Boston. And what's interesting is that he left when he was about his early 20s, and he went to join the army. Very sad life, of Poe. Both his parents died when he was relatively young. He was taken in by an aunt and uncle, joined the army, was striving to become a poet, hated the city of his birth, hated Boston. And he hated it because he was a unique young voice at a time when the leading lights of literature, especially in Boston, were people like Hawthorne, Longfellow, Emerson, Thoreau, Dickinson. Wonderful writers. Not the commercial popular writer that Poe turned out to be. Poe still influences people today, in terms of movies and his poetry, and not so many people curl up with Emerson. Nothing wrong with Emerson, but they looked down on Poe, and he felt very aggrieved by this, and therefore hated Boston. Hated Boston. And to Boston's credit, on the 200th, 250th, something like that, I forget the math now, of his anniversary of his birth in Boston, the city, just at the end of Tom Menino's term, decided to try to, even though he's gone, and they can't make amends personally, they wanted to say all is forgiven. We embrace Edgar Allan Poe. We're sorry for how he felt about us, but we embrace him as our native son. And they commissioned a sculpture. And a wonderful sculptor in upstate New York named Stephanie Rocknack got the commission. And the city charged her with, they said, listen, we want you to make this sculpture, and we want you to incorporate in this sculpture Poe's troubled relationship with Boston. She was like, really? Really? And how do you propose I do that? So she knew that she didn't want to have like a big plaque of text. She settled. Anybody seen the Poe sculpture in downtown Boston? You really should make an effort to see it. It's easy to miss because it's actual size. Most statues are built 10 times bigger than the person because they end up looking very small. If they're actual size, they end up looking very small, and people can't believe that's actual size. So they make them bigger, often 10 times bigger, right? So she decided, first of all, she was going to make this actual size. He was short. He was 5'5". So it's very easy to miss. It's at the corner of South Charles Street and Boylston Street, just at the beginning of the South End, right? And it's a brilliant device she came up with to incorporate the troubled relationship with Poe. Very simple. It was just how she oriented the statue. So the statue has his back to the city, and he's facing the house where he was born, and he's carrying a satchel that's filled with all these iconic images of Poe's poetry. The telltale heart is falling out, right? The raven is flying off his briefcase. But he's got his back to the city, and he's facing the home where he was born, as if he's going off to visit his birth house. So it's a great sculpture. You should check it out. Anyone else? So listen, thank you very much for joining me tonight. I really appreciate it. If you would like to read more about these feuds, especially most of those which I didn't talk about, I will set up camp right here. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Wicked Pissed, I would be honored to personally sign one for you at no extra charge. I also have copies of my first book, New England Notebook, which is not about feuds, but rather just about some of my favorite stories, reporting around New England for 20 years. I have that here as well. And whether you buy a book or not, I have a sign-up sheet right here for my newsletter. So if you'd like to give me your email address, there is a 50-50 chance you'll never hear from me again. But there's a better than even chance you will, because I have a new book coming out in the fall, and I try, as it gets closer to a new book, to share with people on my newsletter list some of the stuff that's coming up and that isn't out yet. So please do sign the newsletter list. And again, thank you so much for coming tonight. I appreciate it. Thank you.